Hello everyone, welcome back to This Is Why We Stand. My name is Joe Archino, and today I'm here to talk about the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army. Now, for most people who listen to This Is Why We Stand, you know that, of course, This Is Why We Stand, the name is pretty much dedicated primarily to American history, United States military history, but I have always made it clear that it's very important that we also recognize the sacrifices of our allies throughout history. And I think as we descend upon July 1st, we are 101 years since the Battle of the Somme of the First World War. This battle was one of the most important battles of World War I and in world history because, like I said at the beginning, this was the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army, and I think it's very important that we understand this battle. And in Europe, and especially in England, this battle is well known by just about everyone. To them, it's like talking about the Battle of Gettysburg to us. But I think to Americans, we do need to understand the importance of this battle and its significance. So without any further ado, I'm going to start right now. Last year was basically the 100th anniversary of this incredible battle. So 2017 basically marks 101 years since this battle. And you've heard me in a couple other episodes that I've done talk about how 1916 was such an important year for the First World War. Two of the biggest battles of World War I are fought in 1916, and then, of course, in 1917, the United States gets involved in the war. But the Battle of Verdun and then the Battle of the Somme are two of the biggest battles of World War I. They both happened in 1916. In the Battle of the Somme, it was a joint Franco-British operation, and although the British would handle the main responsibilities of the Battle of the Somme, the French did have an important part in it as well. But basically what this was is it was going to help take pressure off of the French at Verdun. Verdun had started before the Battle of the Somme, and then basically at the Somme, the British were going to launch this massive offensive, which would take pressure off of the French, who were struggling for their lives against a massive German army at the Battle of Verdun. When we look at this, it's one of the largest battles of World War I. It's one of the bloodiest battles in history. At the end of it, the Battle of the Somme lasted for 141 days, and in its aftermath, there's over 1 million casualties, which I think you just listened to there, and that really starts to put it into perspective how big this battle was and how costly the battle was. Basically, what was happening around this time was, after 2 years of continuous trench warfare, the Allies really wanted to make a renewed offensive push. The war really, it was just becoming bogged down in the trenches. Neither side was really gaining much ground or doing much in the war. It was really just becoming a stalemate, and I think that's largely how we remember World War I, by being a stalemate. The Battle of the Somme, or the Somme Offensive as it's also commonly known, was designed to kind of help break that stalemate and push the Germans back. One of the important things to understand here also is, at the beginning of World War I, most historians would agree that Britain probably had the best professional army in Europe. It wasn't the biggest. Germany had a bigger army than Britain did at this time, right when war started in 1914. But Britain had the most experience and most well-trained professional army. But by this time, most of Britain's professional army had sustained massive losses because it became very clear early on in this war that how devastating the body count was going to be. So Britain had lost so much of its professional army that at this point they had much more new troops. Many of them were inexperienced, and many of them would see combat for the first time at the Battle of the Somme, and that would explain so much of the carnage. Before July 1st, the Allies bombarded the German trenches for a week straight. 7 days they bombarded the German trenches in hopes that it would bombard it and it would just totally wipe out their defenses and wreak so much havoc and destruction that the infantry, when they came out of their trenches and advanced to the German positions, they would face very light resistance or no resistance at all. And just to show you how intense this bombardment was, the British and Allied artillery, they fired 1,738,000 shells at the German position. So I think that shows you right there, they weren't fooling around. For 7 days, they fired over 1 million shells. But unfortunately for them, the impact of their bombardment was minimal, to say the least. At 0 hour on July 1st, 1916, the Allies left their trenches and advanced toward the German positions, and the artillery shifted away from the German front trenches while the infantry was advancing, because they, of course, the infantry is going to be heading in this direction. You want to take a chance of hitting them, so the artillery kind of shifted away from them at the moment. Many of the British battalions, like I've said, they were entering battle for the first time, so you kind of have to imagine the fear that's going through a lot of these men's mind, because they understood what was happening here. Men had seen, the area in between both sides trenches, most people understand, is known as no man's land, and that it earned that name because no man could survive in that area. You had opposing sides with machine guns and mines and barbed wire. It was a killing ground, the area in between these trenches. So men had understood what was that area constituted, and heading into that for the first time, you can only imagine how much fear would be going through your mind. Basically what happened was some of the inexperienced officers, they ordered their men to advance at a walking pace in evenly spaced lines. So I think that inexperience kind of shows you they're ordering their men to walk at a walking pace, and when you understand what the German defensive positions were, that really wasn't a very good idea. So the problem becomes immediately clear. The Germans had weathered the artillery fire and came up firing and fighting, and this is one of the things that also you need to understand is the Germans, their trenches were built much better than the Allied trenches were. And one of the reasons for that were the Allies kind of never thought they were going to be in one place at one time. They always kind of had the mindset that they were going to be able to advance and move further. And then the Germans, on the other hand, they really took so much care in building the best and most precise trenches, and it showed how well that the trenches held up and how many of their men came up fighting right away. The artillery bombardment did not do what it was intended to do, and then what happens next is just a complete killing ground. Of the 120,000 Allied troops who launched the initial attack, nearly 20,000 were killed, most of them in the first hour of the attack. Another 37,000 were wounded. This combination of 57,470 British casualties was greater than the total combined British casualties in the Crimean, Boer, and Korean Wars. And when I read that for the first time on History.com, I couldn't even comprehend that statement there, that the British lost more men in this opening hour of the battle, basically, than they did in those other three wars combined. Casualties and dead alone. I mean, when you just think about that, that's the story of World War I in a nutshell. That amount of death, that quickly, it is almost unfathomable to think about that much death and that much destruction in that instance. But I'm not done. You go on a little bit more. I've already told you it was the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army. 37 sets of British brothers lost their lives on the battle's first day. One man was killed every 4.4 seconds. Truly brutality on a scale almost unimaginable when you consider that. World War I is a very complicated war. By the end of it, the British certainly had learned from the mistakes that they made early on. And you've already heard me say this battle lasted over 141 days. It will span many months. So the fighting would continue and go on much further after the 1st of July. But the British would learn from their mistakes, and that's something very important. A little bit later in the offensive, they would adopt this strategy called the creeping barrage, and certainly this was learned from the mistakes that were made during the first day of the battle. And what the British did with this creeping barrage basically was they would coordinate artillery with the infantry. So the artillery would fire and continually fire on the German trenches as the infantry moved up behind it. So you've had to kind of consider these two pieces being in sync exactly, so that as the British got to the German trenches, the artillery would still be firing on those trenches. And the problem on the first day of the Battle of the Somme was the artillery was firing on the German trenches, but not on the front lines. So being out of sync, it became a killing ground because the Germans weren't afraid that they were going to get hit by the artillery. this creeping barrage later in the Battle of the Somme, it would kind of alleviate that. The first tank institution of tanks in the First World War were also at the Battle of the Somme. It became very clear early on that this new instrument was flawed in many ways and would be difficult at times to implement. It would break down a lot. It would be struggle to get through the thick muds and the difficult terrain that was created because of trench warfare. But at the same time, military planners saw how useful the tank could be. So many important things come out of the Battle of the Somme, but I think more than anything, what's remembered most is, of course, the losses. By the end of it, Allied forces had launched no fewer than 90 attacks before British Commander-in-Chief Sir Douglas Haig called off the offensive on November 18th. Now, this is the thing that probably is going to make you think even further about how effective this actually was. Over the course of the 141-day battle, the British advanced a total of only 5 miles. And again, when you think the immense loss of life and how long this battle lasted, that is what World War I was. World War I was a battle of attrition. It was a battle of small gains. And before the United States got involved in the conflict in 1917, this is really what the war was turning into. In the aftermath, British troops sustained 420,000 casualties, about 125,000 deaths. 200,000 French casualties were lost. German estimates, a lot of people disagree on what the exact number is. Some people say it's around 465,000. I've seen some say 500,000, but it's probably between 465,000 and 500,000. And when you look at all those numbers, I said at the beginning that the Battle of the Somme, there was about 1 million casualties, and when you add all those numbers up, it is very true, and that is what World War I was. It was just the most sheer, awful brutality. The world had never seen anything like it, and battles like this, battles of like at Verdun, were just something that will be forever embedded in the history of Europe. People, when they visit these fields, it just brings up these memories of just tragic losses of life, of these generations of men who lost their lives on these battlefields, and it really is tragic, and it's something that we should never forget. I do also want to mention, you've heard me talk about a lot about the British Army as a whole, but the British Army encompassed men from many different areas of the British Empire of the time. The British Allied troops basically included men from Australia, India, South Africa, New Zealand, Newfoundland, Canada. So the losses of the Battle of the Somme and of World War I in total were felt all over the world. You had men who were coming to fight for the British crown from almost every corner of its empire, and it wasn't just in England that people were mourning. People all over the world felt the tragic nature of this engagement. One of the other things that I wanted to mention at the end, if I had time for it, was something called PALS battalions. One of the ways that Britain's military figured that they could increase and get more volunteers was introducing something called PALS battalions, which basically guaranteed that at recruiting offices, you could join with your friends, you could join with people from your town, colleagues, and this helped massively increase volunteers for the war, because if people kind of knew, I could go with my friends from my town, I wouldn't be separated, I wouldn't be with people I don't know, I think that changes things, because you already want to be fighting for your country, and if you can be doing it with your neighbors and with your friends, well, I think that certainly helps change things, and that really did help. And at the Battle of the Somme, there was many of these units, of these battalions called PALS battalions, so everyone kind of knew each other, and as you can kind of see already by you now knowing how much sheer carnage there was at the Battle of the Somme, so many of these PALS battalions suffered such heavy losses. One of the instances, and I think one of the great examples, is the Accrington PALs. Basically, this PALs battalion, they lost 584 of the 720 members. They were killed or wounded in the space of 30 minutes in the battle's first day, and this was kind of an example that repeats. So you have to think that since all these men know each other and are probably from the same areas, those individual towns and places are devastated after the Somme. They lose so much of the people that they knew, and things would truly never be the same. I've read so many books about the losses of these PALS battalions, and it truly left, kind of this mark, this absence of these people. Towns just would never be the same after these battalions were wiped out at the Battle of the Somme. And one final note that I did want to bring up is the Battle of the Somme was actually filmed, and the British Army kind of wanted to do this because they believed that people, if they saw the Battle of the Somme, they saw the situation that was happening, it would help people understand how significant, how important it was for everyone to rally behind the war and to invest more and donate more money to the war effort and give it their all and contribute to it. And it is considered the first feature-length war documentary. Almost half of Britain's population flocked to the theaters to see this documentary, and you can kind of imagine back then when, it's not like today where everyone has seen a film, everyone goes to the theater. It's one of those things where so many of these people were seeing the carnage of World War I for the first time. Back then, you couldn't just go in your living room, turn on the TV, and see what was happening. For the first time, so many people were seeing what World War I looked like. They saw it played out in front of their eyes, and you can only imagine the horror that was in front of them. But I think another line that British Commander-in-Chief General Douglas Haig kind of said was, "The nation must be taught to bear losses," and certainly the Somme was all about losses. Although there was some gains, although there was some positives that could be taken away, it largely is a battle remembered by sheer carnage, and nowhere is that more clear than what happened on July 1st, 1916, the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army. And I think it's something that as Americans, we must also recognize, because our great ally and friend in Great Britain, the significance of World War I and the sacrifices that they made, we must always remember their sacrifices as well, because they have shared in our struggle to build a better world for everyone. But I want to thank everyone for listening to this episode as always. Until the next time, Joe Archino here with This Is Why We Stand. For more great content, you can visit thisiswhywestand.net. And until the next time, I'll see everybody.